Hey everybody, this is Roshan Sagani. I'm one of the tutors and med school tutors. So today I just wanted to talk about, this is a pretty crazy time when it comes to step one and step two. And we're basically have like, a very fundamental change in how step one is going to be tested. So without further ado, I think it's important that we help applicants kind of understand what they can do if they are trying to get their test done, before this change in time in January. So what can you do to maximize this, if you have a dedicated period starting now, what testing strategies can we help you with, and what can we do from a calendar sort of standpoint? Um, we're gonna have my colleague just introduce himself, and then we're gonna begin. Okay.
Definitely. Hey, everyone. I'm Camden McDowell. I'm a MS3 as part of the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Princeton MD PhD program. And I've been with med school tutors for a few years now. And I have only tutored step one. So I think about step one all the time, every day. And so I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all today to help you strategize to get the most out of your dedicated period.
All right. So really quickly, kind of just to introduce who we are at MST. So I think actually before we even talk about MST, I think me and Camden are a great example of what MST can offer. I'm a PGY3, Camden is the MS3, and in between we literally have every single stage, MS4s, PGY1, PGY2, we have attendings who tutor here. And the benefit of that is that we have people in every single circumstance. So even though I still tutor step one, Camden might have his nose a little bit closer to the newer resources. He may be more familiar with other techniques. So if someone wants that, they can be matched with him versus be matched with me. The big thing is that at MST, what we have is one-on-one online tutoring. We have had a lot of different people in different phases of their medical career teach with us, and that allows us to really do a very good job of matching students with their tutors. And so whether that has to do with the tutor structuring style, whether you want someone who's a little bit closer and more familiar with the day-to-day demands of your schedule, or if you want someone who's kind of been through this and wants some more mentoring. And it's not just tutoring that we offer, but also I kind of am a little bit further in my career. I can offer a little bit of mentoring regarding, what specialty choice, regarding interviews, et cetera. And similarly, Camden is a little bit closer to the, applying to med school. Granted, he's doing his PhD right now, but I just think it just allows us to offer a lot of insight about, different phases of the whole medical school process and even going into residency. So what we're planning on covering tonight is, the number one thing that I think people get worked up with is, they want to have an idea of where they stand. And so the biggest way to do that is, their first MBME. That's something that I think can cause a lot of anxiety, but it's something that I think as long as you understand the value of the MBME, that it's a tool to help you progress rather than a barometer of what your future score is, it'll really kind of give you a very good idea of what you want to do with your dedicated period. In addition, we're going to talk about the best resources, how to develop a good study schedule, and also incorporating resources into that. And what I think will be the best thing to do is, one, we're going to talk about how to maximize the use of UWorld. And I think that, that alone, I think can provide a lot of people with the tools that they need to get, a 240 plus score. And then we're going to go over a little bit of question dissection, which I think it's really cool that you have two different tutors here. You can see our different approaches to everything. We'll do a step one style, we'll do a couple step one questions, and then finally we'll do a live Q&A. In regards to the Q&A, please feel free to, shoot over some questions during the presentation. Maybe me and Camden will be able to answer during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll definitely do our best to answer towards the end. Okay. And without further ado, Camden's going to take it over.
Definitely. Thanks. Thanks for the intro. Yeah. So right now, I suspect a lot of you out there are starting to think about your step one dedicated period. And, there's a lot of changes happening. Step one's going pass fail. And, as you start to prepare for that, it's really important that, as Roshan said, you get a barometer. You kind of get a reading of where you're at as you start this whole process. And so that's what this first MBME is about. Maybe a few weeks out before you start dedicated, or a little bit longer if you're a bit more nervous, take an MBME. And the goal of this MBME is not to stress you out about your score. The goal of this initial MBME is just to figure out where you're at and where you're at respective to where your goals are. And that kind of makes it fun. It's, it's just an assessment to get you started. And then that's going to allow you to use that assessment to start to figure out how to design a study schedule that really is tailored to your unique situation. And so that's how I want you to have this first MBME in your mind. And the one thing that MBMEs are great about, particularly the newer ones, is they output a respective score overall, but also your score on individual subjects. And this can really be valuable when you're building your initial calendar. So for example, if you're really weak on farm, a lot of students come into step one weak on farm, and farm is a really crushable, high yield, good subject to nail for step one. Then that's something that you can start to prioritize in the beginning. Make flashcards throughout your dedicated. Start that early so that you can capitalize on your entire dedicated period. And the goal then for these MBMEs is you want to see your score increase over time. Again, never stress yourself out about how fast it's increasing or how slow it's increasing. It's a process, it's a marathon, and you're going to want to see that advancement over time. So that's really how you use these MBMEs. They're great assessment tools, a little bit less for kind of learning tools, but they're good assessment tools. And Roshan, is there anything you want to add to that?
So I think I would 100% agree with you. And I think one thing you said in particular really resonates in the sense that, these tests are, sure, everyone wants to get an idea of what they're, where they're at. And I think the number one question you see on forums, et cetera, is that, how can I predict my score based on my MBME? And I think we all agree with that. We can understand that. But I think Canada brings up a great point that these are supposed to kind of be used as an idea of, what you need to work on. Because sure, it's great to know where you stand, but at the end of the day, you want to know, okay, I got these questions wrong. Why did I get them wrong? What can I do to fix that? Was it a content issue? Was it a timing issue? That's where MBMEs can really help you. UWorld mostly will help you with understanding, from a content perspective, but I thought MBMEs really kind of helped you understand, am I fully understanding the gist of this question? Am I, doing timing correctly? And then, sure, while it's good to get an idea of where you're at with the MBME, the biggest thing is, like Camden says, using the trend. If you see that your trend is going upwards with your MBMEs, then you clearly are benefiting from your dedicated period.
Exactly.
So in terms of primary resources, and I'm curious to see if Camden did anything additionally, I primarily used, First Aid in UWorld with a little bit of Sketchy and Pathoma, of course. In regards to these two resources, I have two fundamental tips for both. First Aid, first and foremost, is a very dense sort of book, but it has, I think when someone told me this, it really resonated with me, is that if you were to tab an open, somehow step one was open book and you had First Aid with you, no matter what, would be able to get a minimum of 255 because almost every single answer is in First Aid. You may not think so. You may say, oh, this is completely out of left field. And sure, there are those rare questions here and there, but for the most part, First Aid encompasses everything that you need to know. Now, the reason I mentioned that is because, understanding that it is a very dense book for that reason, because it has so much information. So the one thing that I thought was really helpful with First Aid, and granted, now you're a little bit more in the dedicated period, but for people who even are, not necessarily planning on doing their step one for a score, but, they just want to get themselves in the right position. One thing I would recommend is make sure that First Aid, the first time you're seeing it, is not necessarily your dedicated period. See if you can run through it. Maybe sometimes if you have if your, program does corresponding organ systems, like they do cardiology, see if you can run through the First Aid cardiology section. So that way it's not the first time you're ever looking through these things. Now, if for instance, this is the first time you have your beginning of your dedicated, this is your first time you're seeing First Aid, I wouldn't worry at all. I would just know what its most fundamental use is, and that will be just providing great information with great mnemonics and graphics. So in that sense, it's all about knowing what to key in on. If you really need to work on your content review, that's where UWorld will come in. I'm briefly going to talk about that. But for those mnemonics and remembering, those little small minutia, First Aid will really be that number one tool for you. The next thing is UWorld. So UWorld, in my opinion, is just like, probably the most fundamental thing in like my medical career. Like I feel like I've learned so much from UWorld, just the way to think. And the way I would think of UWorld is it's truly like a textbook. When you do UWorld, you should be reading every single word out of every single question. And the reason for that is that, these have, these questions have so much information. They're so detailed But even if you get a question right, there's no way you probably know every single thing that the question means. So always look at the question and answer choices, always read those explanations, and you'll just keep accumulating information. It may not seem like that at first. It may seem like, initially you're really struggling on UWorld, you're getting less than 50%. Just push through and understand that, that's part of the process. But if you keep working towards it, you will learn a ton from UWorld, and you'll be able to reinforce that, with additional resources. But these two are probably all you really need to really do well. Anything else, Camden?
Oh, definitely. These really are the two resources. I'm just going to echo this and say it again, and I'll say it again because people are going to tell you need 10 different resources to pass step one and to do well in step one. No, you don't. You need first aid and you need UWorld, and then you can supplement as needed with some others. And the way I always like to think about it is first aid's your kind of your friend throughout this process. And it is what you're going to fall back on. It's sort of the grounding resource to use because it has everything that you need to know for step one. And just like Rashawn said, you're going to want to incorporate it throughout your M2 year, if possible, if you're at that point. UWorld, this is kind of like your mentor, your advisor who's quizzing you a little bit and challenging you. And at first, when you're working with them, you're going to feel a little bit bad. You're like, wow, I am not getting the scores I want. That is okay. We've all been there. It's going to get better. You're going to learn. The key is to use it smartly, and we'll kind of get through about how to break down some UWorld questions later and how to really capitalize on them, and to do pattern recognition from UWorld and build up your repertoire of just comfort with all the different ways that step one examiners can ask the same question, because they really try to get at every factoid from as many different angles as possible, or use the same vignette and ask as many questions as possible. And so these really are two great resources to get comfortable with. And if you do need some secondary resources, there's the Rapid Review Pathology, BRS Physiology, and my personal favorite, and the one that I relied on most, which is the Fundamentals of Pathology by Sitar. And really what these resources are not the first thing that you grab, in my opinion. These resources are what you grab when you're working your way through, maybe you've gone through your first pass at dedicated, or you enter dedicated knowing that you're really uncomfortable with a certain subject. And this is what you grab when you want to fill in those details. And first aid can be hard sometimes because it's just sort of like a flashcard, and it's really dense. And sometimes you just need a little bit more grounding information, maybe listen to a short video from Pathoma that helps ground UWorld with first aid sort of cohesively. And that's really where these additional resources come in. In particular, some of the very first chapters of Pathoma can be really strong resources for getting a background on the basic kind of pathology and pathophysiology that underlie the vast majority of step one questions. Anything else to add on that?
Yeah, and one thing I just want to mention about Pathoma that I think Dr. Sitar does very well is that when it comes to step one and UWorld, you'll notice that there's kind of this idea of a step, almost like pattern recognition, like Camden said. And so I think Pathoma does a really good job of explaining that, if you know kind of the basic tenets of this pathological process, you may not, and suppose it goes from A to B to C, you may not always remember B, but if you understand what's going on in A and you understand what's going on in C, you can use that knowledge to then discern, okay, what's the missing step? Because you understand the nuances of the pathophysiology. And I think the beauty of Pathoma is he really does a very good job of illustrating that, a very stepwise kind of progression of how pathology develops in, all of his chapters. And I do think that really helps you get the idea of what UWorld, what step one is testing, in that sense of okay, do you really understand what's going on, or have you just been memorizing facts? Because the one thing that a lot of people will say about step one is they presented the question, I knew the topic, but they just presented just slightly different than what I'm used to. And a lot of people get very tripped up on that because they're so used to seeing, heart failure presented in one fundamental way. But if you really understand the pathophysiology, it shouldn't seem like that it's that foreign because you're understanding the concept. And I think Pathoma, much like for the reason that Camden and I probably love it, does a really good job of that.
Exactly.
So, kind of, not to beleaguer this too much, but the idea of like studying is all about kind of laying your resources. It's very important that you don't just do, you're not like just doing first aid for like 2 weeks, then UWorld, then these additional resources. It's about finding what works for you, avoiding resource fatigue, and making sure you're using it in an efficient manner. So I think the best way to describe this would be, my personal study schedule of how I layer the resources. I think if we can get Camden's perspective about how he did it, that might be, just give you some idea. So, one thing is on the third section, I think a lot of people probably recognize the Anki symbol. I personally am not an Anki user. Like I know that there's people who love Anki, who like swear by it. I personally never really found that it just worked well for me. I was not a flashcard person. And so I felt like, I knew I could succeed in step one, and even my future tests without using Anki. But it's important to understand, I think that I was able to figure out what my strengths and weaknesses were. And that was what I tried to work really hard towards. So what I personally did was I had an idea of how long I had my dedicated period, 6 weeks. I knew I had a little bit of familiarity with first aid. I'd gone through about 20 to 25% of UWorld already. So I knew that, okay, I know how UWorld works. I know I can increase my question load. First aid, I know I need to incorporate that. I need to get through this. So what I did was I used a basic calculator to divide how many pages of first aid there are with how many days, because I wanted to go through my first pass of first aid, like a thorough pass in 4 weeks. I had 2 weeks remaining, and then I was just going to go over parts that I highlighted on my first pass, which I thought were confusing. So for the first 4 hours of the day, I would do that. I would go through first aid, and it would be a certain number of pages. Even if I was in the middle of an organ system, I would just stop, because I think that was the easiest way for me to know that, okay, I've done this. It prevented me from getting too burnt out because I knew I had a steady goal in mind of a page number. Then I used to do UWorld questions for the rest of the day. Generally, I would, head over. I would switch, where I was studying. I would read in my room, and then I would either go to the library or like a Starbucks. I would study. I would do questions from about 11 to 6 or 7, targeting about 100 to 120 questions through the first 4 weeks, and then increasing that volume later. And then what I did was I had a fundamental goal of how many pages I wanted to get done, how many questions I wanted to get done. And then in the remaining time, if I finished early, sometimes I would just take, an easy day and say, okay, I finished at 5, I'm good. Sometimes I would say, okay, I have this extra, I have an extra hour or two that I was planning on doing first day in UWorld. Now let me do the pathoma, let me do the sketchy. I didn't plan on doing it every day. And, the point of it is that, my schedule may not be perfect, but it worked very well for what I personally thought I needed. And I like to, do a lot of questions. I think that's one of my strengths. I can go through questions very quickly. So I highlighted that strength. So I think it's all about figuring out what works well for you and then layering the resources and making sure that you have a consistent schedule.
Definitely, Roshan. So I'll go and talk a little bit about my experience with layering these resources, because it parallels what you did. But I think it also highlights the uniqueness that you can do when you're preparing for step one and really tailor it to your own situation. When I entered dedicated, I knew that I had some other research commitments that I would have to balance a little bit during that time. And so I prepared a little bit starting before I entered dedicated. I became really familiar during my M2 year with first aid and the appendix of first aid. If I can stress one thing to any of you M2s out there, really get familiar with the appendix of first aid and flipping back through it and knowing about where, page numbers of different diseases, because that just speeds everything up when you're flipping back between UWorld and first aid. And I played to my strengths. I knew that first aid was something I was really comfortable with. And so I started off with a heavier review of that in about 40 to 60 questions of UWorld a day. And I kind of tailored that over time, where I started increasing that quizzing bank with UWorld that I'd already been familiar with during M2, and then kind of tapered down my first aid as I got closer to the exam. So that's how I layered it. And the big thing that worked for me was to layer within a block during the day. So when I finished UWorld and I was going through my UWorld questions and reviewing them, if I felt a little bit uneasy about a subject, I would jump back to first aid to really tie those two resources together. And I encourage you to help integrate the complexity of first aid. That's a fun way to do it. And then partway through, just getting to talking about number 3 here is I didn't use Anki. I really didn't use Border Bronze or BRS, but like I said earlier, I used Pathoma. And I used it when about 4 weeks out from my exam, I realized man, I still am really weak on basic pathology and some of those fundamentals. And that's where I brought that in to fill in that weakness for a few days. And it really made a big improvement in that. So you have to be a little bit flexible in your calendar, I guess is what I'm saying, as you're layering these resources.
And then, yeah, just one last point regarding the layering resources. I just want to mention, like, so now you've heard one perspective from me, you've heard one perspective from Canada. And then, for instance, I had a student who had a little bit of a different idea. I'm a big do UWorld twice guy. And I think like I stress that a lot, but it may not be, the strategy that works for everyone. I had a student who said, like, are you sure that like that's the only way? I've heard very good things about Amboss. I said, you know what, you're right. Like, this is not the only way to do it. They had done UWorld a little bit later in their preparation, so they wanted something. They similarly were very good at going through questions, but then they felt that the questions would be too recent for them. They would remember them, and I did understand where they're coming from. So I said, go ahead and use Amboss. And they, because they had heard good things and they used Amboss, they loved it. They actually felt that it was equally as good as UWorld with additional, variety of questions. And they said, like maybe from now on you should say everyone should just do UWorld and Amboss. And I said, I think I'm going to start incorporating Amboss more into my recommendations. It was not something that was as popular when I was a student, but I have used it. I am familiar with it. But I just think the big thing that I think this highlights is that, you can have, and that student did extremely well, by the way, is that you can have 3 different people, 3 different study styles, and they can really just all do well as long as you have a fundamental uses of first aid and UWorld, and then you know how to layer them. And the biggest thing is your strengths and you highlight those strengths, you are on a good path for success.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then, there you had 3 different examples of how different people can tackle step 1 with a basic, shared in general sort of structure at its root. And I think that's something worth emphasizing is why you want to personalize everything. And, we often work with students to like figure out what works best for you. There is a fundamental structure that seems to work really well for a lot of people. And that's kind of the approach to the overall schedule. So maybe not a particular subject, but how you spend your dedicated period. And the approach that seems to work well for the vast majority of students is what we call a 3-pass approach. And this is a little bit similar to what you heard on the previous slide, which is where you take a few weeks at the beginning of dedicated. Let's say you have an 8-week time, you take about 3 to 4 weeks. And you do a pass 1 through the material. The objective of this pass is to build a picture, get a breadth of knowledge. You're not going for depth of knowledge here. You're getting a breadth of knowledge of what are you going to see on this exam? Like what possibly could they ask you about, and build that mental picture. And you're going to do this, often first aid is really good here. You're going to start incorporating that UWorld right from the beginning and leveraging that. And the important thing here is you want to touch on all subjects. And often you do it in a bit of a systematic way, by organ system. That's what a lot of students like. And some students prefer it to be a little bit more mixed up to keep them fresh. But again, the goal here is to establish the scope of the test. And the biggest thing that I always encourage students is don't get caught in that nitty gritty. Don't stress about that nitty gritty too much right now, because we can always come back to that if it's nitty gritty about a particularly high yield subject. So once you have that first pass underneath your belt, then I like to go to, pass 2. And this is where you start to crank those UWorld questions and really get active in how you're studying. And you're still going to, leverage things like first aid and maybe pathomas during this time to supplement and target resources, target weaknesses that are high yield. The timeline of an MI. That's one that I always like to have students focus on during this time, or subjects like that. And then the other thing you're going to do during this time is start to have some retention. And so you just saw all the material in that first pass. And what you want to do now is you want to make sure you don't have information go in one ear and out the other. You want to keep it in there. And the way to start doing this is with flashcards. If you're a student that likes using flashcards, which not all of us are, or use something like a UWorld journal that we can maybe talk about a little bit later that can be used to help build retention through that time. Now, I want to emphasize one thing, and that is this is not necessarily required that you do 3 passes through the material. Honestly, most of the time, 1 or 2 passes with the time that you have during dedicated, that's all you need. And so you can taper it a little bit where you increase to 80, maybe 90, maybe 100 questions a day during that second pass as you prepare for your exam. But if you have time, it can be really beneficial to take a 3rd pass through the material. And this is where you emphasize some of the crushable subjects, pharm, microbiome, some of those factoids from biochem, and you start really quizzing yourself heavily on UWorld questions. And this is the opportunity to fill in those gaps in your knowledge with easy points, and you're not going to be trying to learning nitty gritty at this point. And so I think collectively that sort of arc, though, that you see at the bottom here of UWorld questions increasing, structured review decreasing, is in general helpful for a lot of students if you then tailor it a little bit to each individual's personality and study style.
So, in general, when it comes to developing a study plan, we can't stress this enough. Like I said, it's about, finding your strengths, but you should have a goal for both, each system. And by system, we generally talk about organ systems. You should have an idea of, okay, like, a mental idea. Okay, I'm strong in cardiology. This is just something I need to briefly review and then kind of move on. Nephrology, I struggle with. I want to focus more on those UWorld questions. I may need some supplemental material to help me maybe review that pathoma chapter. Rather than just read it, I'm going to watch the video, or I'm going to watch supplemental YouTube videos. So just have an idea of what you're looking to get from each, organ system. And then also, even for instance, like thinking about things like even broader, like microbiology or Canada mentioned pharmacology, getting an idea of where you stand in each section, and then accordingly understanding how much time needed to dedicate to that. Developing a calendar, I think, is very important. I think it just helps you feel a sense of accomplishment as you're studying. Because if you do have a consistent calendar, then it does feel good to check off those boxes. And if you have developed a good calendar, and that's something I think we do very, very well here at MST. I think if there's one thing I really offer to my students is a very well structured calendar based on their needs and their times, and their schedule. It allows you to then make sure that you're doing the most for yourself to get the most out of your dedicated period. Doing the math, I mentioned that I literally use a calculator to just divide the number of pages, but just have a realistic idea. You have this many UWorld questions you want to do. You have this much first aid you want to get through. And once again, that's something I think that we can help you with based on your score needs, what you're looking for. We can help decide, this is about how much content you want to be, through and comfortable with before you proceed. And the biggest thing is that it's important to come up with a realistic plan. Not everyone has a true dedicated period. Some people are also doing their rotations. They have research obligations like Cam did. And he made adjustments knowing that he wouldn't be able to have the same dedicated period that some of his other colleagues may have had. I, on the other hand, had a 6-week period. So I knew that even if I had lofty goals for 8 hours studying, doing first aid, doing UWorld, and incorporating these other resources, it was possible. But just try to be realistic, because if you set an unrealistic schedule and you're not able to meet it, then 1, you're not really adhering to the schedule. 2, you're not really sure what progress you're making. And then you may just be in a point where, you've put too much on your plate, and now you're not even getting the most out of whatever resources you have been using.
Definitely. I want to add, build off of one thing you said there and highlight the final line of also be adaptive. Your calendar that you set that very first day, you want to stick to it, just for the purpose of discipline and working through the material at a good pace, but also be willing to adapt it. It's okay to change your calendar a little bit as you go through. And a lot of students sometimes feel uncomfortable with that. And that's where, it's really, fun being there and tutoring them and being like, it's okay to change this calendar, because we can do better on this test if we just tweak our approach a little bit and maybe incorporate a new resource here, or maybe get rid of a little bit of a resource here. And so adaptation, kind of being adaptive, is an important part of this calendar.
Very good point. Very, very good point.
So I want to preface this slide by saying this is a sample calendar. Everyone's a little bit different. This is just to give you a broad picture of what a quote unquote classic approach to a step 1 exam would be. And you say, this is 8 weeks. Historically, that's usually around the length that a dedicated study plan is. And you see that you go through the material in a very systematic way, often by organ systems. This mimics how you do it during a lot of the first M1 and M2 years at med school. And, you work your way through it. Often I like to start off with cardiopulm, just like it's on here, because those have a lot of that rich pathophysiology that sometimes you can be weak on when it's been a little bit since you returned to it. And you maybe want to keep some of the more, quote unquote, memorization, like micro or pharm and biochem, often, a little bit closer to test day so that it doesn't, you have better retention. So that's the first general picture of this. And you can also see that we hit multiple subjects multiple times. This kind of gets back to what we were talking about a few slides ago, where you don't want to just see the material once. You want to see the material multiple times throughout your study schedule, be that through first aid or be that through UWorld or through any other resource. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight on this calendar is the assessments. You want to assess your progress. And, the percentage you're getting right on UWorld, that's a good assessment. That's more of a learning tool, though. What I like to encourage is have students sprinkle in the MBMEs throughout their study period. Usually just after the first 2 weeks, like seen here, and then maybe another 2-week separation, but then increase frequency about a week apart as you progress through your study schedule. So you can build this trend over time of, are you retaining the information that you're studying? Is it working? And so by week 5, whether or not these things are working and how you can maybe, tailor your, final few weeks that you have to capitalize on the resources you have to do the best on step 1. And then the final thing I actually want to point out on this that is not on this slide, but I really encourage my students is, remember, this is 8 weeks. That's a long time. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so you need to incorporate time for rest within this. You're not going to be taking weeks off. I usually don't encourage that for students, but definitely make sure to incorporate time within your study schedule to recuperate, be it a half day here or maybe, even, a whole day off, depending on how comfortable you feel with where you are, so that you don't burn out, which I think particularly in the last year of remote learning is a really important feature as you enter into this dedicated period of a lot of independent study. And actually, there's one point. Sorry, can we jump back? There's one last point I wanted to emphasize here, which is that final day of rest. You also want to taper. You don't. You often hear about students that are studying right up to test day, and that's a great way to stress yourself out and psych yourself out. You've got this by test day. You're ready to take the exam. So take some time off the day before.
So, and I want to just add really quickly. One, I 100% agree with that. I literally cannot stress that enough to my students. And I think it's just very important. You have to understand that, the day before the test, you've done everything you can. It's important to relax and important to just give yourself time to breathe. Maybe if you're nervous, you can do, 1 or 2 questions or like maybe 10 questions, make sure you still got it. But for the most part, you need to relax. People don't really realize, but I think it's, it's very, not obvious. But if you're confident, you're in a good headspace, you will be able to get the most out of your studying. But if you're, you didn't sleep well or you're anxious, you're going to be second guessing yourself and you're going to be wondering why. And part of that is just going to be the anxiety that maybe what you would have had regardless. And I think everyone has a little bit of anxiety, but maybe you could mitigate that by just relaxing, resting, and making sure that you're in your best possible headspace prior to your exam. And then another thing I just wanted to mention, it's more just a broader thing, is that we have these assessments here, and I've noticed this with my a couple of my students, and I think it's very important to note that yes, the MBMEs, we talked about them, they're barometer and that you can use them as a trend for success. But I remember I had a student who had a very good baseline MBME score, and then they were kind of stagnant for the the next 2-3 MBMEs. And it was so frustrating for them. And I really felt bad for them because they were so fixated on these scores. But then, the one thing that we were able to realize is that, at the end of the day, did they feel like they were acquiring content knowledge and improving? They said without a doubt, 100%. The UWorld averages were improving. They felt more confident. Their knowledge base definitely was better. And the other thing is that, we dissected why were they getting these questions wrong. And some of them we just chalked up to, it's maybe not your fault. The NBME questions notoriously can be phrased oddly. You're just, and not oddly in like a good sense that it's just like a different perspective. It's just like it's not presented in the best possible way. So the reason I bring that up is that, it's very important that, during your dedicated period, you are doing assessments, you are seeing where you stand, but don't get hung up on these scores. You have to have a very kind of holistic view of where your studying is at, where your progress is at. And then, yeah, the scores will start to improve. They should, and they should reflect that. But speaking of that student, their best NBME was actually 10 points worse than what they got on their actual step one. And they were ecstatic about that. And I'll be honest, like, as a tutor, I can say whatever I want, but I was very confident that those NBMEs were not reflecting their knowledge base. I knew that their step one score was going to be better than those tests. And I think just by stressing that to them enough, it did make a difference. And anything to add with this the timeline, Camden?
No, I think that sums it up really well.
Sounds good. And okay, so one last slide, and then we're going to get to a part I think a lot of you guys will like, where we're going to go over some questions. So be honest with yourself and set realistic goals. The reason we mentioned that is that, one, is that when it comes to goals, it's important of how much you can study, and two, having a realistic idea of what score you can achieve. I think with the right amount of studying, the right amount of hard work, most people can get, a very, sought after score. But that being said, if you have not, developed good fundamentals in medical school, you don't really have a very strong understanding of basic physiology, basic pathophysiology. There may be many reasons for that, but it's important to understand that, no dedicated period will be able to, help teach you 2 years worth of schooling, So it's important that you understand the dedicated period is a time to hone in all the knowledge you have, but it should be knowledge you've acquired. So try to be realistic with your goals, know what your limitations are in terms of what time you have to study, what your base content knowledge is, and then use that to have a realistic idea of, what kind of score you're looking for. A quick note about, try to make sure that, you understand, we'll keep saying, these buzzwords like a marathon, and it is really a marathon. So, avoid, getting burnt out. I agree with Canada. It's really important to incorporate breaks into your schedule, sometimes micro breaks, sometimes a nice half day, but you need to understand that, even though it seems like six to 8 weeks is a short period of time, it is, it's over 2 months, so understand that it's going to be exhausting. It's going to be tiring. And you just have to kind of push through, knowing that at the end of the day, you'll be able to take your test, knowing that you put your best foot forward. And just know that just because you're spending hours studying doesn't necessarily mean it's quality study. And that's why it's important that sometimes you just need that break day. You're kind of just slogging through these questions. You're not really reading through the answer choices. You're not really getting much from first aid. Take a break, take a step back, and make sure that when you are studying, you're really getting the most out of your studying, so that, you can have that free time for yourself.
Yeah,
Anything else to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to build right off of what you're saying, which is one little trick that I like to encourage my students to use when it comes to assessing your own quality is every UWorld block. If you have a little bit of time at the very end, just ask yourself, did I really read that last question? Because a lot of the time you're going through, and by the time you get to the 40th question, the UWorld block, you read the vignette and you read the vignette and you read the vignette again. Mm-hmm. That's when you start to know, look, I'm not putting my all into this, something else. I need to either take a little bit of a break, or I need to reassess my approach. And that's a great way to get that feeling for, like, am I putting in that quality time, which is so important. You don't have to spend, 20-hour days. That's impossible. You want to spend good hours when you are studying. Yeah. So tips to reach your best score. And this is, I also, this is adaptable to not only your score, but also pass fail. Passing step is a big accomplishment. And so you want to prepare yourself to get to that point. And so these are just a few of the tips that I think a lot of the tutors share when it comes to how to reach whatever your goals are. And one is when you're going through first aid, like we said earlier, it has every bit of information you really need for this exam, but it's also going to be really hard and discouraging if you try to agonize over every little detail. This is why you do that first pass through first aid and you get comfortable with it, because you want to see the breadth, not necessarily the depth, the breadth of the figures. Hone in on the enzymes that have numbers on them, on the charts. Hone in on the pictures. Hone in on the bolded words and the acronyms, but don't necessarily agonize over individual pages. And then, I'm not even going to spend too much time on this next one because we've already hit it, which is don't use too many resources. Instead, use the resources that you do have, that you do select, use them optimally. So use that first aid and UWorld optimally. And just like we said earlier, when you're going through UWorld, it's okay to be a little bit frustrated with your scores at first. That's part of the process. I think we've all been there where you're not scoring the percentages that you want to be getting. And that's because UWorld takes time. And it's going to take time for you to remember everything as you go through it. Breadth and depth are equally important. So when you have that initial big picture that you have as you go into dedicated and you start to do that first pass of the material, then you're going to want to supplement that with depth through UWorld and through a little bit more revisiting of first aid on high yield material. And then just like we said earlier, be adaptable. Your schedule is going to change and that is okay. And it's actually critical to get where you need to be. And then don't overstudy a topic. Oftentimes students, my students get nervous that they really don't have cardio on lock yet on that first week, for example. And so rather than spending 3 days, they start spending 4 or 5 days and they want to really know every little detail of cardio. Sometimes you just got to know when to move on. And, that's one of the things I like, being here as a tutor is to provide you that validation that, yes, it is time to move on to that next subject and keep working our way through. And then keep in mind high yield. And actually, I would direct you to some of the med school tutors blogs for some particularly high yield material. There's some great ones on there about, different organ systems and what's high yield. But you want to focus on the stuff that you in first aid that you see UWorld questions on. And you want to focus on UWorld questions that, over 50% of people are getting those right. That is the highest yield material in UWorld, and that's the highest yield material in first aid. And this is where, particularly as step one becomes pass fail, you don't have to know every tiny little detail. It's going to be really about building this big picture of high yield information, which is what, the USMLE wants you to, test. That's what this test is about. Is are you ready in general to be moved to clerkships and have that knowledge base? And so that's really what you're trying to do. Roshan, do you want to add anything to that?
I think everything that you explained, I would 110% agree. I actually really like that point about the 50%. It's something I actually personally never really thought about, but it honestly makes a lot of sense. Those are the questions you absolutely have to get, the ones where the majority of people are getting, because those are probably the most commonly tested topics. And it's always important to understand that people fall within a bell curve for step one, and there is to some extent some sort of curve. And so, I think people get really worked up because, on step one, they'll see these, crazy questions that they've never seen before. And the thing I always say is you will see those, you will come across that. But for as much as you're confused, the person right next to you is probably equally has never seen that. So try not to get worked up over that. But to your point, the ones that you should be getting right, you really want to make sure you're not missing those. So that's why it's really important to have a good fundamental understanding of, high yield content.
Yeah, I want to jump in just with a quick thing I tell all my students when they see on test day. If you see, this is a side point, but if you see one of those questions that you're like, wow, I have no clue what they're asking me, that's okay. Just tell yourself it's one of the questions that they're using, that they're going to throw out and they're using to build next year's exam. That's a nice little thing to keep in your back pocket.
100%. So, just quickly, we've kind of discussed using UWorld. I just want to mention a couple things. One is that you want to use UWorld to learn. Yeah, sure, it's good to use the percentages to get an idea of where you're at, but I strongly recommend you use UWorld as a textbook. Okay, and with any textbook, you want to be able to take notes. So there's a general consensus about, how to take notes. There's the flashcard stance. You can use Anki, which I in my opinion, is probably the best flashcard method to use. But, some people have some other preferences. But I think Anki's algorithm is just very well done. Or you could take UWorld notes. And I personally used to take UWorld notes. So they have a notes function, which I honestly think is very underutilized. I think it's very good at, you can just, on any question, you can jot down relevant notes. It'll correspond the question ID. So suppose, and you can generate these notes. So at the end, I had 17 pages of notes I 2 to 3 days before my test day, I just went through my UWorld notes. Occasionally I would see a note and say, I don't really think that like this is enough information. I use the corresponding question ID to look up the question and then just read through the answer explanation again, and I felt much more comfortable. So that's something I can't stress enough. There is a camp that likes to use Excel. It's a little bit more organized. You can organize it based on organ system. You can do it by question type, etc. Either way is fine. I think it's just important that if there is something in UWorld that you come across that you're like, I honestly did not know that, the best way to synthesize that information is to take a note one way or another. Either that's a flashcard, handwritten notes, which I don't necessarily recommend as much because that takes a lot of time. Type notes can be a little bit faster, but just remember that UWorld is a resource that it's as much as it's great as it is. You have to make sure you're getting the most out of it, and the way to do that is just having a good systematic approach to how do you address these questions, how do you learn from these questions, and how do you make sure that you're going to retain that information later. Anything else to add?
I totally agree with everything you're saying. And in particular, I like how you highlighted the UWorld Notes feature. Very few people seem to know that even exists. And it's a great resource to have because it ties it to that UWorld explanation, which is super useful. And then I also wanted to emphasize this right here. So many students, because there's such great, rich information in UWorld, get a little bit bogged down in some of the nitty gritty. And you should read every explanation of UWorld. But again, you're not rewriting first aid. You're not here to rewrite and take notes on and write a first aid textbook yourself. You're here to distill information. So I always encourage students, whether or not you're using the flashcards function or if you're doing a UWorld notebook or a UWorld journal, to distill every question down to the key fact that you had to know in order to get that question right. And what I like about that is that it's personalized to you, so that your flashcard is what you needed to know to get that question right. So you have a really high yield bank of about 3,000 flashcards by the time you're done working through UWorld. And then, of course, you have to quiz those flashcards. So that's important to incorporate into your schedule. Yeah. Okay. So now that we're talking about UWorld, I think it would be fun to break down some questions. So we're not going to, break down this question in particular, but what I want to use this slide to do is emphasize how you break down a UWorld question. UWorld questions are dense. There's a lot going on. There's pictures, there's tests, there's blood labs, and it's helpful to have a very systematic approach to how you work through these questions. And there's, a few different camps out there for the exact way to do it. And our goal here is to give you kind of a general picture of how we would do it and how I think a lot of tutors do it. But the very first thing you want to do is you want to frame yourself to the question. And you do that by, I like to poke in and look just, what are they asking me? Like, that is the very first thing I read in the vignette. Which of the following autopsy findings is most likely to be seen? Okay, great. So I know it's probably a second order question. I need to figure out the diagnosis and then know something about the pathophysiology. Awesome. Then you're going to scan the answers real quick. And this gives you a picture just, okay, I'm going to be doing something with the lungs. Great. And then you go back and you look at the vignette and, we highlight some things I want you to pay attention to. But what you want to pay attention to is you want to go through and you want to think about things like, what are the demographics of this patient? What are their vitals? What are the signs and symptoms? And build this clinical picture. So you have a few diagnoses, a few differentials that you work through. And over time, you'll get pattern recognition to figure out, what questions they usually ask in similar ways, because it will mimic that potentially on step one. Then you're going to want to break down, and then you go to the labs and imaging. These should sort of be the things, labs and imaging I like to use to confirm what other diagnosis or differential that you have, those suspicions that you have. And then use all of that collectively to start to exclude answers that that can't be true. And that's really key. You want to take and get rid of anything that obviously can't be true due to the facts that are in the vignette. And then you can hone in, and usually you'll have two answers left. And you want to say which one of those answers is the most supported. And so that's when you often will go back through anything you highlighted in the vignette and ask that highlight, what does it support most? Does it support this answer or this answer? And that's going to narrow you in and allow you to get to the answer. So that's sort of the systematic approach that I like to encourage my students to take. Do you have anything to add to that, Roshan?
So I think I think the best thing to do is we have a couple questions, and I think it'll be really cool for whoever's kind of listening in to see how we both approach questions. I think we do it a little bit differently, even from talking to you beforehand. And I think the big point is just having a clear, systematic way. And I think the big thing to add is that the way you develop the systematic way is through practice. Where do you get the practice? UWorld, Amboss, generally just doing questions. So
Exactly.
why don't we just go ahead and get started?
Sure.
Okay, so question one. So I want everyone to just take a second to read the question, about 10 seconds, 10, 15 seconds. And then I'm going to just look at the question, and I'm just going to talk aloud about how, what I see when I read through a question. I generally will, once again, then just to kind of point out before we start, I think it's all about figuring out your strengths. So what are my strengths? I think I can read through questions pretty fast. But occasionally I notice that I'll miss details because I'm very good at skimming, but I'm not good at fully getting the most in the question. So what I'll usually do is I'll skim through the question, try to read as fast as I can, try to use pattern recognition, buzzwords to get an idea. Can I answer the question? Do I feel confident about the answer? And I'll usually, when I'm reading through the questions, try to have a guess at what the answer choice is. I don't spend too long on this, but I just try to have an idea. Okay, what am I looking for in the answer choices? So that way the answer choices don't bias me. Now, if that all matches up and my guess is immediately one of the answer choices, I just go ahead and pick it and then move on to the next question. If I'm not sure, and but I still feel relatively confident, I'll use the mark feature and know that I'll come back to it. And if I'm really not sure, there should be, in theory, like something that I must have missed. Otherwise, or it's just a very difficult question, but then I'll kind of reread a little bit slower and go through it. So why doesn't it? I'm going to have everybody take one, like I said, a couple seconds to just read through the question, and then we're going to begin. Okay, so hopefully you guys have been able to at least go through the beginnings of the question, but I'm just going to start for the sake of time. So we have a 37-year-old pregnant woman. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, pregnancy, there is things that change from their physiology standpoint. That's something that I want to know at 22 weeks gestation. So we're definitely going to have hormonal and physiologic changes. The patient's complaining of cough and dyspnea on exertion for the past month. So as soon as I hear cough, I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be maybe something upper respiratory, maybe some pulmonary issues, and dyspnea. So dyspnea, shortness of breath. And now I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's something cardio or pulmonary. Occasional palpitations. Now that's a buzzword for me. That maybe we're in atrial fibrillation. Maybe there's some sort of electrical issue. But now I'm thinking once again, there's something wrong with the cardio system, and one instance of coughing of blood. So hemoptysis. I'm not sure what to make of that just yet. She's noticed progressively worsening shortness of breath over the last month. So that's kind of during the course of her pregnancy. That's giving you a timeline, and now unable to sleep flat. That's for me, a key feature. Unable to sleep flat, that's pretty classic for some degree of pulmonary edema. I'm not exactly sure yet why, but I would suspect that she has some sort of cardio and pulmonary process going on based on what I've read so far. She has no fevers, chills, sputum production, runny nose, or chest pain. So lack of chest pain, okay, maybe it's not necessarily something like an MI, and she's in heart failure that's causing that, and she has some sort of electrical issue and also like a reduced ejection fraction. No fever, chills. Whenever I hear hemoptysis, I'm immediately thinking to myself, okay, could this be TB? But there's no fevers or chills or sputum production, and then no significant past medical history. So this isn't something that may have been lingering. Pregnancy is uncomplicated. She does not smoke, drink alcohol, or use illicit drugs, and she moved from the United States to Indonesia 15 years ago. So that's something that Camden mentioned to you guys, using demographics. Most of the times in these questions, all the information they're giving you is deliberate. So it's important to incorporate all that. So I've kind of now gone through this whole process. So in the time that I took to speak aloud, I generally will be able to go through this faster, but I have an idea that we have a cardiac and a pulmonary process going on. I know that the patient, I've ruled out a couple of acute pathologies that could cause this picture. And now I have this idea that the patient's from a third world country, so they're more prone to a couple of more rare diseases. Now I'm going to get a little bit more information. So that she is afebrile, her blood pressure is within normal limits. She has an irregular heartbeat, and she's tachycardic. And then on lung exam, she has crackles at the base bilaterally. That's something kind of that I already knew, right? She has dyspnea. She's unable to sleep flat. I kind of suspected that. So now, what am I most likely to hear on cardiac auscultation? So I've gone through this whole question, and now I do have a clear idea of what I think is going on. I think that she has some sort of cardiopathology, and I would suspect that, because of her history of being from Indonesia, that, she has some degree of mitral stenosis. How did I get that? So I know that, for instance, she has pulmonary edema. So there's got to be some issue, with flow through the heart. And I know that she's from Indonesia. She definitely has risk for a disease process, which would be rheumatic fever, which could cause the mitral stenosis. So the mitral stenosis explains everything for me. It explains why the heartbeat is irregular, because we're not getting adequate flow. It explains why that she would have pulmonary edema, because that valve is scarred over. We're not getting adequate flow through there, and even would explain the hemoptysis, because the lung, when there's enough back pressure, even the lung vessels can break, and that can cause the hemoptysis. So now I'm thinking to myself, okay, I know that we have mitral stenosis, and that's something that the question is expecting you to understand. They expect you to come to this diagnosis. And to be honest, the number one thing that really helps me is actually that demographic. They're from Indonesia, from a foreign country. They're at risk for something like this. So now I have mitral stenosis. So I know that, aortic versus mitral, what is traveling through each valve in diastole versus systole. Mitral, the mitral valve is being, you're going to get more blood flow through diastole. So I know I'm looking for a diastolic sort of murmur. So now I'm looking at these answer choices. I'm not going to go over each one what the answer choice corresponds to for the sake of time, but I do see that E mentions a diastolic murmur. And if I was doing this question like myself, at baseline, I would hopefully have, finished this question in about 60 to 90 seconds. I see that I'm looking for a diastolic murmur. I see that as E. I pick it and I move on. Generally, I used to have like 15, 20 minutes, and I could go back to questions and just say, okay, like maybe I should just look this over one more time. But just for the sake of time, let's see, does E fit everything I'm looking for? I do. It should be a diastolic murmur. It should be late, because that's classic for mitral stenosis. And the best place to hear the mitral valve is over the cardiac apex. So that's kind of what we're kind of discussing. And I think Camden would have had like maybe a slightly different approach to answering this question. But the big thing is that we try to use all the facts in the question to have a clear framework of what pathology is going on. And then we try to have a mental idea of the corresponding answer choice. So that way we don't get tripped up. And then we are able to use that to determine the right answer. Now, the big thing here is that, this will initially seem like, oh my God, there's so much information. I don't know what was permanent, what wasn't. Technically, all of it was permanent, but at the same time, I could have read the last, the first line that she was having dyspnea on exertion. I could have read that she came from Indonesia 15 years ago, and I could have had those vitals. And in theory, I could have said, I wouldn't have been able to necessarily know exactly what answer it was, but I should have been able to say, okay, E is a realistic answer. So the reason I bring that up is just, it's important to know that using all the information you have, using the buzzwords, some of it may be excessive, most of it is pertinent. But you don't need every single fact to come to the answer choice. So even if you're not recognizing, for instance, I don't know why this patient is having hemoptysis. I don't associate that with mitral stenosis. That's okay. Do all the other answer choices, do all the other clues in the question answer your question? If so, then just go ahead and pick it and be confident. So that's question one. We have two more questions to go. I really hope you guys, find this helpful. And I think it'll be cool once, I'm going to do the next question, and then Camden's going to do the one after that, just to see, how we approach these questions. Okay, so similarly, I want everyone to take 15, 20 seconds to just read through this question, and then we're going to go over it. Okay, so let's begin with this question. So I have And I really like this question for a couple reasons, and I'm going to explain why. So we have a 67-year-old male. He came to the emergency department with crushing chest pain. Immediately when I hear crushing chest pain, I'm thinking that he had an MI. Usually has mild pain after walking 3 blocks. So they're giving you the idea that this guy has risk factors. He does have angina at baseline, but now he has chest pain at rest. Now we're concerned for an MI. Worsening shortness of breath and sputum production over the past 2 years, along with a 70-pack-year smoking history. So we have risk factors as to why you would have an MI, but also that he's just an unhealthy guy in general. And now, I think all this time about an MI, they finally give me evidence, and I could have skipped the beginning, right? Because they say the EKG has a left circumflex ST elevation MI. So that's why I think there's a little bit benefit in getting used to kind of skimming through and reading these questions a little bit faster, because technically the first couple of lines I didn't really need, because that line tells me everything I need to know. He has a left circumflex ST MI. So they tell me that he has a stent, discharged later 2 days later on optimal medical therapy, or DMARD, so aspirin, clopidogrel, and propranolol. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, that's the standard. But now they say the next day he presents the emergency department with 2 hours of shortness of breath. Vitals are as follows. And I'm not going to read the vitals, but generally what I'll do is I'll quickly skim through, see what's abnormal. Blood pressure, is a little bit high, doesn't look horrible. But the respiratory rate is up, and the O2 sat is definitely down. And the cardiovascular exam, though, shows normal S1 and S2 and normal jugular venous pressure. So whenever I think of shortness of breath, I think, is it the lungs or is it the heart? If it was the heart and I was having pulmonary edema causing shortness of breath, sure, I could have a decreased O2 sat, but I would see some JVD likely. And so that's telling me, okay, yeah, I mean, granted, you could have pulmonary edema without JVD. JVD is more indicative of like systemic edema, but in general, it's a good idea of someone's fluid status if they have normal JVD. Normal jugular venous pressure. And then I hear this pulmonary exam, and it demonstrates a prolonged expiratory phase. And so they're asking what's the presentation? What's the reason for this presentation? So a couple things. So I hear this prolonged expiratory phase. I know this patient is a smoker. Already, they have risk factors for a COPD exacerbation. So that's what I'm thinking. Now, if I wanted to, and the big thing is, cardiac tamponade. Yeah, that can happen post-MI. That's a risk factor, but I'd have normal jugular venous pressure. So I'm crossing that out. Arrhythmia, the heart rate is not that irregular. So I'm not thinking that. Decompensated congestive heart failure. The pulmonary exam, they're talking about a prolonged expiratory phase, not necessarily, that they have crackles. And stent thrombosis, they were discharged on aspirin, Plavix, and, you have a normal S1 and S2. So I quickly can mentally, within a couple seconds, get rid of all those answer choices. And I say, okay, by elimination, it's E, a COPD exacerbation. Now, I would go ahead and just pick that alone. Now, suppose I was saying, okay, why did he have a COPD exacerbation? There is a clear answer. I'm hoping a lot of you recognized it. But this is an example of one where, like, okay, suppose for some reason you missed. And the reason for, by the way, that he may have had the COPD exacerbation is because the propranolol, there's the known risk factor with beta blockers exacerbating COPD. And so we tend to avoid them, especially when you think about it. The way I always remember is, you will often give Donabs, albuterol, and ipratropium to people with COPD. So if you're blocking that, you're blocking something that naturally is helping their lungs expand a little bit better. But suppose, you don't remember that relationship between the propranolol and the COPD exacerbation. It's important to understand, and I want to point out that you still could have easily answered this question without knowing that by rule of, eliminating the answer choices. So I think my 2 points when I kind of go over these, or my main points, is that have a style about how you like to answer questions, be adaptable, know that, there's certain, techniques that are essential, like recognizing buzzwords, being able to quickly, see what's important in a question. Like, for instance, recognizing that, they're telling you off the bat that he had an STMI, but he has after 2 days later, normal S1 and S2. And then finally, there's different ways to answer a question based on what the question's giving you. So the previous question, I definitely thought, okay, I can predict exactly what answer choice I'm looking for. Here, it was I found that, okay, maybe going through the answer choices will help me because I'm a little bit confused, but I can rule them out. But just knowing that, play to your strengths and then figure out based on your strengths how to adapt your style a little bit. So we're going to go over to question 3, and then we're going to see how Canada does questions. And then if you have any questions on how we're approaching things, if there's anything we can help with, we're more than happy to answer that.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, hopefully this provides a kind of a nice little contrast. So actually, before you read through it, I want to walk through it with you, exactly how I read it. And we kind of do it sentence by sentence as we work through this question. So you see it in kind of real time, the same way I would read through this question. So I'd start off with looking at the last sentence, which is, which of the following is most likely responsible for this patient's edema? Then I see a bunch of pressures. And what that does is I start to think, okay, I am looking for first finding the diagnosis of what's going on in this patient. And then I'm going to need to know some, pathophysiology fact. Then I jump to the vignette. So 54-year-old man presents to the emergency department for lower extremity swelling. A lot of words. The key facts here, though, for me, lower extremity swelling and 54-year-old man. He also has noticed that his urine has had an uncharacteristic frothy appearance recently. That's a buzzword right there. Frothy, I'm thinking protein in the urine. I'm thinking this is going to be a question potentially about the renal system. Past medical history includes hypertension, type 2 diabetes, but he states he's been medication uncompliant. That's a flag for step 1 questions. If he's not been taking his medication, he has type 2 diabetes, he has hypertension, his kidneys are going to be shot. We're going to have all the ramifications of someone who has had uncontrolled diabetes and hypertension for a long time. The other key fact I take away from this, years. We're looking for a chronic condition here, most likely. Vital signs, and I approach vital signs very similar to Roshan. I see blood pressure sticks out to me, but that's pretty much it. Physical exam reveals 3+ pitting edema up to the knees bilaterally, as well as periorbital swelling. The fact of this sentence for me is swelling, and we have swelling all over the body in many different locations. That starts to think, okay, if we're thinking about pressures from the answers, we're thinking about swelling, I'm thinking about some sort of systemic effect. I also think the kidneys are implicated, so I'm thinking about ions, I'm thinking about proteins, I'm thinking about things in the blood that in turn could lead to this main feature of swelling. A urinalysis reveals 4+ proteinuria and fatty casts without ketones. This is screaming to me nephrotic condition. The reason I know that is because for step 1 purposes, anything 3+ or 4+ protein, I'm thinking nephrotic if there's no blood. If I see blood in the urine and something maybe like 1+ protein, I'm thinking nephritic. If I see a little bit of both, I'm thinking a mixed condition. And so that's where I start to use those factoids. Serum glucose is 248. So it's high, and it's obviously probably been high for a long period of time since he hasn't taken his medication. The complete blood count is normal. So now that I have this picture in my head, I am thinking my differential is uncontrolled diabetes, given all the facts that they've given us, leading to some nephrotic condition. Then I'm using my knowledge from first aid to say, okay, he probably has diabetic nephropathy with Kimmel-Steele-Wheelston lesions on histology. All of those facts come kind of rushing back to my head. And I know that when I have a nephrotic condition, that I'm going to be losing proteins. I'm going to be losing lots of things in my urine, but in particular proteins. And in the context of swelling, I know that there are certain proteins, for example, albumin, that is really important for balancing the pressures within our blood, and in particular, our oncotic pressure, which is basically the amount of stuff you have in your blood that helps regulate whether or not fluid is going to flow out into the interstitium or not. So with that in mind, I know I'm looking for something like oncotic pressure that gets me down to, here we are, where are we? E and looks like B. And all I really have to ask myself at that point then is, do I think that the oncotic pressure is going up, or do I think it's going down? Well, I know I'm losing I'm losing proteins. And so I'm thinking B, decreased capillary oncotic pressure. And that's kind of how I get to that particular answer. And I want to emphasize one thing here is you don't actually have to know that there's diabetes, even though it's really screaming that at you. Instead, you just need to be able to tie together some of that pathophysiology to think nephrotic condition, I'm losing proteins, I'm losing the charge barrier on my glomerulus, and that in turn is going to lead to disruptions in the oncotic pressure in my blood. So I think hopefully that provides sort of a nice context about the different ways we do it. And what I want to emphasize there is there's no wrong way. There's optimal ways for each individual. And that's one of the fun things about being a tutor is I like to kind of figure out what works best for every single student. Sometimes my method works really well, and sometimes it doesn't a little bit. And we have a really quick reader who can distill that information fast. And so kind of 2 passes through the question, like Roshan did, can be really beneficial. And so it's all about taking your strengths and running with them.
So just to summarize before we go to the Q&A, I just want to talk about, what we do here at MST. I think the best thing is, I think Camden said it beautifully. We take your strengths and we run with them. I think we do a very good job of, even before you even sign up, we do a free consultation, get an idea, what are you looking for from tutoring? Are you looking for someone who can help you with the schedule? Are you looking for someone who can help you go through questions, approach them in a systematic way? Are you looking for someone who can be, just a motivator and be there to help you kind of navigate through a lot of the logistics that are associated with medical school and residency? But the one thing we can always promise you that's consistent is one-on-one tutoring. We'll do a very good job of kind of adapting to your strengths as a student, and then trying to figure out the best ways to do it. So to put in perspective, for some of my students, I used to do kind of PowerPoint lectures going over topics. All of the other students, we used to just kind of literally kind of go through questions together, talk through them. How do you approach them? But the big thing is that we try to customize it to each student. So if you're interested, please definitely check us out. And definitely, just understand that even if you're not necessarily looking to sign up for, long-term tutoring or a class, we're always there to help you in any which way. So check out our blog, check out our resources. We want you guys to succeed and, get to the spots where you want to be. And if that, unfortunately, that means that, your step 1 score means a lot. And I know that's a lot of pressure, but we're here to help you, take some of that pressure off and help you get the best possible score. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we, answer any questions that you guys may have? There was one question about kind of by one of our panelists. It was basically like, how do you know when you're ready to take the exam? I think that's a pretty loaded question. I'm curious to see what Camden has to say about that. For me, I think it goes that I had a goal score, and my goal score was to get above a 245. And I knew that once my MBME scores were within 5 of that, I felt comfortable knowing that, okay, I think I'm ready. But it was also, I'll be honest, a feel sort of thing. I had a 6-week dedicated, and to be honest, I probably could not have done a week more. I felt myself even towards like that last week fading, and I wasn't really able to study more. And I said, okay, at this point, I've studied as much as I possibly can. If I continue to study more, I may not be able to hit it with the same intensity. And if I'm not, then I'm going to be forgetting some of the stuff that I, worked so hard to memorize. So I said, at the end of the day, my practice scores are kind of close to where I want them. I feel like I'm, kind of in the process of not being able to continue this sort of like, regimented studying. Let me take this test. It's, for some people, they want a perfect answer that says, okay, I get that. I got this score. I met these benchmarks. I'm ready. I'm going to be the first one to say, unfortunately, as much as I wish that were a thing, it's not always, some people, yeah, sure, they may be able to approach it that way. But for the most part, it is a feel sort of thing. The one thing I want to add, once again, is at med school tutors, the benefit of having a tutor who's, had, worked with other students, had their own personal history. I think we do have a pretty good feel of when someone is ready, based on what their goals are, based on what their needs are.
Exactly. I want to build off one thing on that for anyone out there who might be taking it after pass fail. I have a very similar approach to you for, when you're thinking about the score and are you ready? But when you're, as we move to, pass fail on step 1, I think it also, for a lot of students, it might behoove them to this, you want to be confident that you're going to be passing this exam, as it moves away from an exact score. And that offers a little bit of flexibility because you don't have to worry about that exact score quite as much. But you definitely, I think, as students, transition to this pass fail, I usually assess readiness as saying, are my MBMEs passing? And not just one, if possible, do I have multiple passing MBMEs? And so if you want a more objective measure of, are you ready to pass this exam? That's usually one I lean towards. Again, a lot of it's by feel, but a more objective measure as we transition to pass fail is, do you have 2 or more MBMEs that are, nicely above that passing threshold?
And just to quickly segue from that, there is another question about, Is there any different things that we would do when approaching pass fail? So personally, honestly, I don't. I think it's important that you still kind of have a very good idea of what you need to be studying in terms of like kind of thinking of it as a kind of a long-term approach when you're studying during the year. And then also, I think it does behoove you to have not as intense of a dedicated period, but a dedicated period. And the reason for that is this: when now that step one is pass fail, at the end of the day, yes, the stakes are lower. That's good. And I think it will help a lot of people with anxiety and stress and knowing that, okay, I need to go through this information. But I'll be honest, talking to some other program directors, talking to some other people, it looks like, step two is now just going to have a lot more weight. So the big thing is, okay, so then how do I make sure I do well in step two? It's honestly the number one thing you can do for yourself is have a good, solid, foundation step one. And I can see Camden nodding, and I think he would definitely agree. But that's the only point I make is that, yes, I think it's okay to take your foot off the gas pedal, have a less intense dedicated period, knowing that, okay, it's pass fail, you won't be getting this 3-digit score. But I think it's very important that you get a very, very good solid basis and understanding. And the best way to do that is kind of what we mentioned, doing first aid, doing UWorld, doing pathoma, and making sure that you have a very, very good foundation. Because I'll be honest, step two, I don't think it's going to be the same way that it was previously, where it's, just thought of, okay, yeah, it's important. Step one's the most important. Now step two, I think step two will now become a very prominent test, because at the end of the day, you have to put yourself in the perspective of program directors. They've historically always had numerical measures to grade med students, and they're going to stick to what they know.
Exactly. And I want to build off one thing on that first of all, I agree with everything you're saying as well. But then also I want to put it out there as, things transition to pass fail. Preemptively, I want to say for any students that may, it's good. It can allow you to relax a little bit. But I also want to encourage, those of you that are out there that it's always good to be a little bit ahead of the game on this. As the worst thing you want is to get, a week out from your step exam and it's pass fail and you're not really comfortably above that passing threshold yet. And so I just always encourage students, reach out early and reach out often to us, to anyone who, is providing you with advice about how to tackle this exam, anyone at your school, any advisors, reach out early and reach out often, because just because it's pass fail, it's A, important for your step two performance, but B, it's not a time to ease up completely. We still got to, get through this exam and excel. There's some other questions on here. Do you want to take the one, is it better to have a low step one 3-digit score or a pass and then work? Oh, sorry. Now, I believe this question is asking, take it before the pass fail threshold.
Yeah. So I think this is a personal opinion thing. But in my opinion, I personally think that at the end of the day, a pass, you can't distinguish the difference between, anyone's pass. It's not a high pass, not a low pass, it's a pass. So rather than, have a low digit score, if you feel like you're not going to be fully prepared, that's fine. Then this actually works very well for you. If you feel like, for some reason or another, you're not going to be fully ready with the dedicated period, you're not going to be able to put your best foot forward and get the best possible 3-digit score, then I would personally, just take it as pass fail, knowing that step two is going to mean a lot. There's going to be a lot of cards on the table. But if you feel confident that you'll be able to study for step two and provide adequate time, that may be the best algorithm for your success, because then, it's all about the optics. What are program directors seeing? If they're seeing a pass, they're seeing a lot of other passes. So, there's nothing distinguishing you, and they see a high step two score. That's all they know you for. On the other hand, if they see a low step one score and then a high step two score, they're not sure. Am I getting the applicant with a low step one score, or am I getting the applicant with a high step two score? And instead of having to convince them of one or the other, instead, if you can just show them, one really solid score and you have them use that as a basis, I think that serves you pretty well.
Yep.
So I think we're pretty much close to wrapping up. So we've got a lot of questions so far. We're more than happy to answer any additional questions. We have an email service that we can answer that's listed here in the slides, and also a phone number. And feel free to reach out. And we'll do. We'll try our best to answer. It may not be me or Camden, but it'll definitely be some of our some of our additional tutors, we're going to try to get through, last few questions. And then if there's anything that, you maybe wanted to ask, but we ended a little bit earlier than you would have liked, definitely feel free to reach out through those emails or that phone number.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question. Which MBME form do you suggest to be taken first to assess where I stand in my prep? I'll go and take this one. I personally don't have a strong preference when it comes to the new MBMEs. So these new MBMEs were released in March, I believe, maybe a little bit before then. And there used to be, with some of the historical MBMEs, tutors would have a preference one over the other. But in general, an MBME is an MBME, and there's so much variability across students for which ones that they do particularly well on, that I think just choose an MBME and go with it. If you like ordered, start with 25, and you can go 26, 27, 28 to keep it simple. But the shorter answer is I don't think that there's a big decision to make there.
Definitely. We have another question about is step 2 like very similar to step 1? I would say in some way, in a simple way, yes. In a more complex way, not necessarily, because step 2 is, it focuses a little bit more on management. Generally, people take this after their third year of medical school where they've done clinical rotations. They will, assess, okay, not only do you understand what disease process is this, but now what are we going to do? Before step 1, in my opinion, it's all about diagnosis, pathophysiology. How did this happen? What is happening? Now, when it comes to step 2, it's saying, okay, well, now, for that patient, where we talked about the patient who had the nephrotic syndrome, what can you do for that? How will you address that? That may be a step 2 question where, you explain to the patient has nephrotic syndrome, they're not asking you, okay, you can present the same exact vignette, but rather than asking the mechanism, they would say, okay, what's the next best step in management? But so that may not seem like it's that similar, because now, you're asking 2 different things. But the similarity is that, at the end of the day, they still want you to recognize what's going on. And you need to be able to recognize the pathology. And in that way, it is very similar between step 1 and step 2. So I would say step 2, it very much builds off of step 1. So especially when it comes to the way that it asks more management questions. But the easiest way to get an idea of how to manage something is to understand that pathology in the first place. And that you'll develop that understanding when you do, when you're studying through your step 1 prep with UWorld and first aid.
There's a great question on here. So I'm just pulling up again. Okay, I can't quite find the question now, but the basic premise of the question was how early should I start studying? It sounds like it's from someone who's earlier on in their med school career. How quickly should I pull out UWorld and first aid and start going to town on it? From day 1, or should I wait? My opinion on this is always, relax. You don't need to tackle it yet. Really focus on your courses during those first, that first year in particular. As you start entering into the second year, then you can start to think about incorporating these resources. But if you start incorporating and really studying hard for step 1 with UWorld and first aid 12 months out, that's a great recipe for burnout. And I don't think that's necessary for the vast majority of students. What you should do is during your courses that, target organ systems, just like we talked about earlier, that's a great opportunity to sprinkle in first aid, to get comfortable with the appendix, to get comfortable where things are. That's really and maybe supplement what your teachers are telling you, but you don't need to, spend hours a day studying first aid early on in the process. If, as you transition and say you're a few months out from your exam, that's a great opportunity to start sprinkling in UWorld questions and first aid questions if you have that flexibility. And that's usually any students that I have that are doing coursework, usually, the spring, if they're taking it in the late spring, that winter is a good time to just start getting comfortable, a few UWorld questions a day, so you can start building up your notes base and get through 2 passes of UWorld by the time you take the exam. That's, if you have that flexibility, that's a great option.
Okay, and I think we have kind of maybe we're going to try one last question, and I think it's going to be, someone's asking that, basically they're saying that, they have their med school classes, they're not as able to, they haven't been kind of, as we've been talking, how it's important to do your UWorld first aid kind of before that dedicated period. But I will admit that, and they bring up the point, if they're doing it pass fail, does that algorithm change? And I would definitely say so. Yeah. Your med school courses, if you're doing well, if you're actually understanding the content, you're really learning, and I'd say the majority of people are, then yeah, 6 weeks I think is ample enough time just to pass step one, because it's important to understand that yes, the dedicated period and doing as well as you possibly can. Sure, you want to be familiar, but if the goal is to pass and it's a pass fail, if you feel like you have a good understanding and your dedicated period is going to be dedicated towards more reviewing content rather than learning new content. And by reviewing content, that means you're seeing something in first aid. It's not the first time you come across this content. Sure, you may have instances like Canada where he felt like he was struggling a little bit with pathophysiology, but he didn't feel like he was learning something brand new for the first time, right? So if you feel like that's the case, that you're not going to be learning brand new information, but rather just relearning, reviewing, I think 6 weeks is more than enough time to get comfortable to the point where you know that you'll confidently be able to pass step one.
Agreed.
All right, guys. So this has been great. We're really happy that we got to spend the time with you. I really hope this was helpful for you. I know this is kind of a stressful period, especially in this kind of transition period where we will be going over to a pass fail system. But just know that you do have support from your school, from us, and just know that no matter how what you're feeling, how scared you are, just understand, just put your best foot forward, you put your hard work in, and just be satisfied knowing that you're putting a lot of you're putting your best effort in, and regardless of your test score, I think it's really important to hang your hat on that.